Hi, everyone. You've heard from me in the introduction, so I won't repeat, my bio, and it'll show up in the chat there. But let me start by sharing my screen, and it is okay. Can everyone see this? Or I guess you can't answer, but hope you can see this. And
we can see it.
Perfect, thank you. And so this symposium is about understanding far-right extremism as an ideology. We just in the previous panel heard about the theoretical roots and foundations. This panel is about how it works, and tomorrow we'll be talking about where far-right extremism has spread. But while we're looking at the movement and how it operates, we also have to think about the people who are involved. Who are these far-right extremists, right? We're talking about what they believe in, what they do, how they do what they do, but who are they? Because becoming involved or aligned with far-right ideology isn't something that people just are, but is something that they become. This is a process. And so the subject of my presentation is about radicalization, which is a way to think about how people become far-right extremists. And it's about the study of this process. And I will focus on introducing this concept of radicalization and the state of the field. Importantly, jumping ahead, this is not an area of study that has a lot of definitional consensus. Neither I nor anyone else who studies this can tell you how any one person will become aligned with the far right. The radicalization process is different for every person. But what I will be doing and what we can have some agreement on are, I can set up the parameters for how we understand and define what is going on with the individuals as they explore their commitment with far-right ideologies. The point that I hope to drive home for everyone today is that when considering far-right commitment at the individual level, we can't just think about these people as bad apples. That's too simplistic, and it misses a lot of important information about why individuals develop an affinity for the far right, what moves them closer to this, and why ultimately they choose to believe and participate in these movements. I'll structure my presentation around these three pithy questions of what is radicalization, why does radicalization happen, and how does it happen? Before I jump into those questions, though, it's important to identify where this concept comes from itself, in case anyone wants to go after this presentation to learn more about radicalization. Until the early 2000s, there were hardly any references to radicalization in academic or really policy literature. It was the terrorist attacks around 9/11, the Madrid bombings and the London bombings that really introduced radicalization as a concept. Before that, it was just the root causes of terrorism. But with this in mind, a lot of the foundations for how we think about radicalization and the frameworks and models that have been developed have really done so with Islamist radicalization in mind. And so this is just important to be cognizant of some of the biases that are baked into some of these models. When you look closer at them, I think it was the NYPD model. At one point, they said, signs of commitment to watch out for is growing a beard. And that's not a transferable lesson that can apply to other ideological groups. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as this understanding of radicalization and focusing on how people grow and move towards an intensifying commitment to ideological groups. But we want to be aware of how some of these ideas, where they came from, but still there are lots of great models and frameworks that have been developed since that have shed some of these biases. So that's just important to flag. And also at the outset, I want to say that radicalization is not used in a definitional sense, right? Radical, if you look up what it means, it's just very new and different from the usual or ordinary. People can say, that group has radical aims or is radical. Historically, there have been a lot of groups that are deemed radical for their time. That's not how we're talking about this process of radicalization. That means something very different that I'll go into. And also the groups, the radicalizing groups and the radical ideologies that we're talking about now with far-right extremism aren't comparable to the previous radical groups, such as, the radical aims of the civil rights movement, which was radical for its time, or even the suffragettes, mainly because those groups were about the expansion of civil liberties and human rights, whereas the radicalization and the radical aims of far-right groups is about the removal of rights and the shrinking of our civil liberties. So that's an important distinction to make at the outset. But jumping in, the first question that I can center a discussion around is, what is radicalization? Like with anything in this area of study, there is no single definition. Academics continue to disagree about how the concept should be defined, and policymakers similarly vary in their definition depending on what problem they're trying to address. But so the most basic information that we can start with is that radicalization is the process by which people become extremists. The least controversial part of this definition is that it's a process. Everyone can agree radicalization does not happen overnight. It's not instantaneous, automatic, or inevitable. And so this can take years, months, weeks for some people, different for everybody. But if we can agree that it's a process, then we have to ask, where does that process end? And this is where disagreement comes from, is that we ask, what makes an extremist? To borrow language from Peter Newman, he calls this the principal conceptual fault line. And this is the tension between notions of radicalization that emphasize extremist beliefs, cognitive radicalization, and those that focus on extremist behavior, behavioral radicalization. And this is a debate then about endpoints. At what point is someone an extremist? Prioritizing cognitive radicalization, you think if someone is a cognitive extremist or a radical, these is about their adoption of ideas that are extreme to what is acceptable in society and a democracy. These are those that deny human rights or democratic principles, whereas behavioral radicalization would look at actions, namely violence, that are extreme to realize one's aims, actions that disregard the life, liberty, and human rights of others. And when we ask, which of these is what makes a radical, the tension here is that there is no necessary and inevitable relationship between these two. People who can adopt radical beliefs may not act upon them, and vice versa. One could act without ever holding some deep and unalterable beliefs. They'll, generally agree with the worldview offered by the ideology, but they're not ideologues in any real sense of the world. And so whichever one we focus on makes assumptions and misses elements captured by the other. And so this is a definition that's important for practical terms. At the, overarching group level, both need to be addressed. Both behavioral radicalization, we're concerned with the violence, as well as the cognitive radicalization, right? We don't want these ideas to spread. But when we think about what can be done, we want to understand the parameters for what is radicalized. And so if you focus on cognitive radicalization of individuals, this runs the risk of policing thought, right? This is a spectrum, the adoption of ideas. And a lot of people will never engage in anything illegal or anything violent. And so to just focus on identifying cognitive radicalization, one, you can't prove it. What's in someone's head is private, right? You can see what they do on the chats, but beyond that, it's very hard to intervene with someone's thoughts in any really criminal way. And then looking at behavioral radicalization, this isn't the necessary outcome of cognitive radicalization. Also, by only prioritizing violence, you are arguably intervene when it's too late, once violence has already happened. This is happy to talk about in the Q&A, and I'm sure Rick, from the perspective of the DHS, also has some insight as to what point intervention is possible with suspected radicalization into violence. But also, if people can cognitively radicalize without ever turning to violence, then maybe that violence is due to something else, not necessarily the inherent radicalization process, but violent tendency in and of themselves. And so when we think about, these far right extremists, who are we talking about? Because if we're only focusing on the people who engage in violence, those might not be the most heavy hitter ideologues that we really care about. Furthermore, only expecting violence as the outcome misses a lot of people who are critical in nonviolent roles, women, often can be very impactful, but will never engage in violence, and movements. I believe the NSM explicitly prohibits their members from engaging in violence. So saying far-right extremists engage in violence isn't everyone, but also then focusing on the adoption of the ideas, that is casting a very large net that isn't really illegal in any sense where intervention is possible, but also is a spectrum in and of itself. So first one is we don't really know where radicalization is or how to define it. Then we're moving on to the question of why do people radicalize? So asking what radicalization is focuses on the end of the process, right? Where does it end? Moving back to the beginning, what attracts people to this in the first place? Either cognitively or behaviorally. In the most practical terms, what do they get from their involvement or alignment with far-right groups or ideas personally? And so the point I want to make here at the outset is that a lot of research has found that white supremacy is not, or white supremacy or far-right ideologies, people joining is not primarily an ideologically driven process. Individuals don't awaken to a radical ideology after which the process occurs, nor do they initially join because they have a strong sense of hatred for the outgroup or with the expectation or even wish to engage in violence. Instead, the opposite is found, where ideological indoctrination follows other forms of personal exposure to groups and ideas, and this fulfillment of needs. And that's the main point here, is that ideological belief indoctrination follows the satisfaction of needs. So this isn't primarily a hate-driven process that research finds, which leads us to the question, what are those needs? What are far-right ideas and groups and extremists able to fulfill within people? And these are feelings of belonging, a sense of significance and purpose, a positive sense of identity. This is what anyone looks for, right? Not just people who are gravitating towards far-right groups, but to matter, to have a sense of significance and purpose. This is what everyone tries to fulfill or find some fulfillment of in their lives. So this in and of itself isn't problematic, this desire. These findings, the motivations for joining far-right and what they get from it are echoed and replicated in many different research projects. I want to flag one here in particular. That's the one in bold, White Supremacists Speak, to which TM is actually a contributor. I think it's a great report that's super accessible and does a really good job of centering the words and perspectives of the former, and in some cases, current radicals themselves. So it's available online, but I'll let TM talk it up if he wants. And they find, and other research finds as well, that this desire to belong, to feel important and to matter, and also to contribute to something bigger than oneself are reasons that people consistently express both with far-right groups as well as other ideological groups as their reason for both moving towards and staying in these groups and increasing their commitment. But if these are the motivations, we want to go even more to the roots of it, of where did these motivations come from? What are the needs where did these needs come from? And we can use the language of vulnerabilities here. The important thing to recognize here is that the vulnerabilities are, the demands created for this positive sense of self, meaning that this positive sense of self was missing. And the absence of, significance and purpose can be instigated by very common circumstances and experiences. Research finds adverse childhood experiences where 61% of people have at least one, are featured in a lot of life story narratives. Individuals' own substance abuse, something as common as receiving an adverse medical diagnosis or some other sort of detrimental event that doesn't allow their life to pan out, or their obstacles to the expectations that they had for their own life. Also, experiences of marginalization and social alienation create this need for improving and restoring this positive sense of self within the individual. What I want to flag here, though, is we run into the specificity problem. The vulnerabilities, this demand for a positive sense of self, do not on their own explain why any one person will radicalize. The specificity problem states where many more people share the characteristics that contribute to these vulnerabilities than will ever radicalize, and much fewer than will engage in violence. So these vulnerabilities, they may create an opening or need for someone to seek significance, but they alone do not guarantee radicalization. But then after thinking about, the vulnerabilities, this demand, we can think about how they're that first point of where they're fulfilled, and those are influences, where they might come from. And so we're used to thinking about far-right extremist influences through this kind of targeted and intentional recruitment. That may be part of it, right? Where it's intentional and explicit targeting, where people are fully aware of what they're getting themselves into. I believe Worthington in Columbus a couple of months ago had KKK pamphlets distributed in people's mailbox on OSU's campus. There were stickers for some neo-Nazi group put up around campus. So there's definitely still this explicit recruitment, but more often is the case that influences can be supportive and familiar, and they're not necessarily targeting. And so a culture of casual racism is, a huge influence that just lies dormant in the US, and a lot of people are familiar with it, such that ideological affiliation or joining isn't so jarring. There's this undercurrent of just knowing what it is. In a lot of cases, influence comes from support networks, either pre-existing support networks, or a new relationship or contact is made that comes from a place of care and acceptance at an individual level or at the group level, where someone begins to feel cared for and like they matter. And all of this to answer the question of why do people radicalize, what I want to challenge is that people do not radicalize for nefarious reasons. They might, but it's rarely that someone is exposed to a far-right ideology and endorse it primarily because they say, yes, this is how the world works, I agree, or out of a hatred for the outgroup, but rather this process is driven by the satisfaction of personal needs, and personal needs that all of us have, but in some cases where people are drawn to the far right, those are the groups and ideas that are able to fulfill those needs. And I think I'm short on time, so then the last point I want to make is then to ask, how do people radicalize? We've looked at the two ends of the spectrum, where people will end up once they radicalize. We don't know what draws people into radicalization, personal reasons, but even then there's a lot of variability. So now we ask how this process actually looks. I want to flag two concepts here. The first is this 3N model by Ari Kuglansky. He identifies that there are three elements that need to come together, and that's the needs, narratives, and networks. This is nonlinear, they can come together in any order, but the needs we talked about in the previous slide, he calls this the quest for significance, which is, an easy way to remember that this universal need to be someone and to be respected and matter. This need or this quest can be awakened by an individual significance loss, a group significance loss, an identity shares, kind of losing the position that it once held and the power, and also an opportunity for significance gain. Next, we have the narratives that also are part of this process. The narratives identify the means by which to achieve significance. In short, the narrative is the ideology, the explanation for the worldview, and tells you how to reclaim the significance that was lost. Narratives have a grievance, a culprit, and a method. The grievance is, the injustice or harm that's been suffered. The culprit is who is responsible for that. And then the method is the warranted and effective way for restoring one's significance, usually by violence. And importantly, these don't need to happen in order, right? You think that first you have a needs, then you hear this narrative, and then you're plugged into a network. Whereas in fact, the networks might be, in the example of a culture of casual racism, those networks might exist. You might have, a racist uncle, or you have, friends. These ideas might exist around you such that the networks aren't necessarily introduced. Similarly with narratives, they might lie dormant and you know what they are. But then when the needs are awoken, these narratives and networks might be activated in a way that kicks this process into gear. And the final point I want to make is what this idea of depluralization is, which I think explains more of the back-end psychology of how people increase their commitment and how they actually radicalize in the intensity and the tension. Essentially what happens is, as someone gains, according to Kohler in his framework, is that explanations for problems and beyond that for an individual's entire worldview become increasingly redefined according to this ideology of the group. So everything that, all the problems that you experience have an explanation that's offered by far-right extremist ideologies or, white supremacy. Why did you lose your job? Why are you unhappy? Why are you unfulfilled? Why are you divorced? All of these problems become increasingly defined, and explanation is offered by the ideology. And the problem then becomes is when this ideology inherently denies the rights of an outgroup, such that all of your problems become blamed on this outgroup. And then the tension builds as the increasing urgency when everything that's going wrong in your life can be attributed to one specific outgroup, and there are not a lot of alternatives to challenging that outgroup. This tension builds, which will, in this model, then lead to violence. So that's another, I think, informative framework that can be helpful for thinking about how people, especially with QAnon, we see that their ideology is so expansive. You think, how can everything be attributed to this cabal of pedophiles? But I think depluralization explains that really well. And so, to briefly conclude, it's not a case, of bad apples. In order to challenge the movement, hard power is important. We do have to address what's going on with the movement itself and the success it's having. But at the individual level, we have to take a more empathetic approach, and we have to think about what these people are getting from the groups that they join, and that's going to be a much harder process to challenge. Thank you.